We're talking this week about Kathleen Folbigg and the inquiry that's unfolding about the murder of her 3 children and the manslaughter of a 4th. Jane Hansen, our reporter, has been there all week listening to the evidence, and she's had some interesting days. Tell us about those, Jane. There's been some explosive new evidence, hasn't there?
That's right. So the inquiry was set down for 2 weeks to hear this science, hear more about this science that suggests that 2 of the girls, Laura and Sarah, inherited a genetic mutation from their mother which causes cardiac arrhythmia and sudden death. So on day 2, when the Danish professors came all the way over from Denmark, they gave their evidence on Tuesday. The original evidence was that the mutation that they had isolated and recreated, they could show in a test tube that it basically stopped calcium binding. And that's an ion that tells your heart to contract. Right. So, and there had been some criticism about that original science, which was published in 2021, and which forced the inquiry to begin with because it was so impressive. 151 scientists signed a petition to release Kathleen Folbigg. But some of the criticism that first came out from cardiologists was that the children were too young, and that didn't fit the clinical experience of children dying of cardiac arrhythmias at that age. It usually happened much older, the 8 years old, 9 years old. And those cases were more associated with sodium channel binding. So the Danish professors put it through more tests only 2 weeks ago and found that this mutation also affected sodium channel binding, which causes heart arrhythmias of another type. So if anything else, it solidified the science and made it stronger. But the inquiry then had to be adjourned so that all the other experts could get their head around the new science.
So you're saying that they did some additional testing just 2 weeks ago and presented it to this inquiry, which was sort of a bit of a shock. And so now we'll have to wait for the next instalment.
That's right.
When will that be?
So the inquiry was always split into 2 weeks in November to listen to the scientific evidence, and 2 weeks in February to listen to all the other evidence, including the diary entries. So you'll remember back in 2003, it was a very circumstantial case. There was absolutely no forensic evidence that any of the children had been suffocated. And it was the diaries and the suggestive nature of that they argued proved her guilt. Highly circumstantial. The diary entries were open to interpretation. There was no blatant, I killed the children. And so the new science and the diary entries and the other evidence will now be heard in a 3-week block in February.
That's really interesting, isn't it? The diary entries, as you say, don't say, I killed the children. No. They do talk about her mental state at the time when she had the children. Is it possible that if you look at the diaries in an entirety,
yes,
this is just a woman talking about the tribulations of life as a mother with young children, and she's getting those things off her chest, and it may not have anything to do with the deaths of the children?
Yeah, so, several people much smarter than me have analysed them, and one is Professor Emma Cunliffe, who's a professor of law, and she wrote Murder, Medicine and Motherhood. She analysed the diaries, and she said some of those entries were disturbing, but when she took them all into account in their entirety, she said it becomes plainly obvious that this is just a woman looking for answers, where there's, like, why did my children die? And she also went into maternal bereavement science, and this is a very common thing for mothers that lose children. They blame themselves. They also blame themselves for things that they've not been able to control and feel guilty about that. So we also, in the podcast, we speak to Professor James Pennybacker, who put those diaries through his AI computer program, which looks for patterns of language that indicates guilt. He found nothing.
That's really interesting, isn't it? So are we hearing all of this evidence at the inquiry?
In February, you'll hear all that evidence about the diaries in February, which was, that lot was put down to listen to psychologists, psychiatrists, which weren't really listened to in the last inquiry in 2019.
Right. So just to recap how we got here, this is the second inquiry, isn't it? She's been called all sorts of things. She's been in jail for how long?
19 years.
Right, okay. And due to serve another, is it?
6 years.
Another
She gets out in 2028. Yep.
Right, okay. So it's a very long time. So during that time, she's been appealing her conviction?
So what happened after she appealed, she lost her appeal, lawyers for Folbigg started looking into the case and hired some other pathologist that would test the original case against her, because there were holes in the original case, because the fourth child, Laura, her autopsy showed evidence of myocarditis, which can kill you. But the pathologist, Dr. Alan Kohler, marked her death undetermined, purely because 3 other children had died in the family. In that autopsy report, Dr. Alan Kohler says, I would be looking to exclude homicide, because if there could be smothering here, because nobody's heard of 4 children in one family suffering from sudden infant death syndrome. What we know now, after the genome was mapped, is that if you have one sudden infant death in a family, you're 4 times more likely to have another one, because of the role of genetics, which can sudden infant death now can be blamed in up to 1 in 3 cases on genetics.
Well, that's extraordinary, isn't it? It throws open the possibility that maybe this is the case and maybe she didn't do it. So I guess there's a lot to come. How's it been in the inquiry? Are all the family there?
No, just her friends.
Just
school
her friends.
Who
Oh, okay.
steadfastly stood by her.
Right, okay.
Craig Folbigg, her ex-husband, does not want anything to do with this inquiry.
Right.
I mean, he's lost 4 children too, let's not forget that.
Yeah.
But I think he's well and truly over it.
Yeah, I'm sure he is. It keeps being dragged up. For him, it must be a nightmare after a nightmare. What do you find the most interesting part of this case, do you think? You've done a podcast on it. You've really taken that deep dive where most of us are just sort of skimming the surface, I guess.
If she's innocent, I can't imagine how it's been for her and how horrific this would have been. But what's been really interesting for me is to find out about her past, which was very traumatic. She was born into a domestic violence family. Her father had already slashed the throat of a previous partner and spent time in jail. Then he took up with Kathleen's mother, Kathleen Donovan, and stabbed her 24 times when Kathleen was only 18 months old. In that time, she was left with him alone. Child protection reports back then suggest that she was sexually abused as well. So here's a kid that's been terribly damaged at a very young age, that has probably learnt to shut down and disassociate. So some of the reports I've read about her, because she came across as cold and unemotional, and in fact Craig had described her grieving as weird. But psychiatrists that have assessed her have said, well, she has complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's how it presents. You shut down for survival.
We've been down this path before with judging people about their grieving process in public, haven't we? I think Lindy Chamberlain sort of springs to mind.
Yes.
And we got it very wrong, I think, as a nation when people thought that she wasn't grieving for her child.
Very judgmental, isn't it?
Very judgmental. She was just doing it in a different way.
Yeah, well, she was possibly in shock.
Yeah, well, of course.
So I think nowadays we're a lot more trauma-informed, I would hope.
Yeah.
But, I've experienced that myself. I lost a child at 8 months of age, and you don't know how to grieve, and there are expectations that you're either supposed to be a blubbering mess, or I don't know how you cope, because, what's your option?
Yeah, that's right.
Or if you do express your horror, people are sort of frightened of that. So it's a very complex area.
Yeah, it certainly is. We'll have to stay tuned to Jane's reporting and to her podcast, Mother's Guilt.